All right, guys, I am continuing my bookshelf tour. So this one here, I shifted some things around since my last video, just ever so slightly. I think my last video, it ended with Milton. Now I had to move some things. So as you see, here's um, 2 volumes edited by George Saintsbury of the Caroline poets, which, think they're roughly 1650, around that time frame. Like Charles the Second, Charles the First, Charles the Second. Then you have the English Civil War in between there. And then we have Brigham Young University Press. Represent. You got to represent for Brigham Young University Press. Has an amazing Arabic philosophy translation program, and this is one of them. Mullah Sadra, the Elixir of the Gnostics. It's I think like 1560 to 1640, maybe around that time frame. Then we have some Milton, Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, Life is a Dream. These aren't strictly in order at the top here. I kind of ran out of room and I wanted to put these 2 Chapman's Homer standing up straight because I want to keep them nicer. So those are, of course, a little bit earlier. Those are more or less contemporary with Shakespeare, but didn't have any room on that shelf anymore. So same with Gongora. He's a little earlier, but he'll just have to do here. Complete shorter poems of Milton. My Paradise Lost is on my favorite shelf. Life of John Milton. That's the best biography of Milton I've found. This Barbara Lewalski. She's the one who edits the Wiley Blackwell Paradise Lost. And we have Dryden, Marvell, Andrew Marvell. I should put him next to Milton because I know they were friends, but it's just slightly out of order. Then we have Grimmelhausen, Benito Jeronimo Feiju, major Spanish essayist. Sir William Davenant, that's also a little bit out of order here too. Then we have Mercurio Volante. He was one of these Mexican polymaths like Sor Juana. And then William Blake. It's also slightly out of order, but it's such a big book. That's the only place I had room. Complete poetry and prose of William Blake. Crazy guy. Then we have my Alexander Pope, the biography, Poems of Alexander Pope, edited by John Butt. And then, for some reason, University of Georgia in the US publishes Tobias Smollett's works. I have The History and Adventures of an Atom, and then his translation of The Adventures of Gil Blas, which is one of those early novels from the, early 1700s. And he translated it a little after that. We have Henry Fielding, a book I've been meaning to read all of. I love the first part that I read, but just got onto other stuff. Tristram Shandy, one of my favorite books. This is my biography of him too, volume 1 and 2, Life and Times of Lawrence Sterne. And then I did notice my first shelf is a little bit more, it covers more of the world. This shelf is definitely, for the most part, basically Eurocentric. But with that being said, I do have The Story of the Stone, the complete translation. So this is the, there's a whole field of studying this book, Redology. The Dream of the Red Chamber, or Story of the Stone are the 2 translations, and this is the full translation I have by David Hawkes. It doesn't say it on there. That's weird. And then following it, we have The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I was trying to decide between putting this in history or in the kind of literature section, although I do have a lot of philosophy and other history here, but I thought it was more appropriate. It's not quite as up to date, but put it in the chronological section here. Yosa Buson, collected haiku, one of my favorite haiku poets. And then The Complete Works and Letters of Charles Lamb. So it's slightly out of order too, but Charles Lamb, famous essayist. I love his essays. And he also wrote kind of tales from Shakespeare with his sister. He was in with the Romantics, the early Romantics like Wordsworth and Southey and Coleridge. Then we have my Goethe collection, which I'm pretty happy with. This was one of the first books I ever read that got me into literature, Goethe's Italian Journey, and I love it. That is the last book I creased the spine on, and that was 10 years ago. I learned my lesson. My Faust Part 1, I'm rereading parts of it, so it's over near my bedside. And in this, there's also a paperback edition of this, Selected Works of Goethe, but I happened to run across the hardcovers for a decent price, and I did have the paperbacks at one time, but I sold those off and then kept the hardcovers. We have Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe. I don't have volume 2 of this biography. And then we have Wordsworth, the Prelude, and then Selected Poetry. We have Jan Potocki, the manuscript found in Saragossa. Been meaning to read this one for a while. Bookmark from Yellowstone. Heinrich Heine, Complete Poems, John Keats, and then Carlyle. Carlyle and John Keats were born the same year, 1795. It's pretty crazy when you think about it. Doesn't seem like they were, but they were, just because Keats died so young. And that's the best edition of Sartor Resartus you can get your hands on. There's also a readily available Oxford, but this one's a nice one if you can get a hold of it. And Biography of Carlyle. Then we get to more of the early 1800s. So we have Thomas Love Peacock. That's from around the same time as, what is it? Oh yeah, Frankenstein. Then Leopardi. I don't have his poetry up. I had it packed away in a box and I just found it, but I already had the shelf already packed. And as you can see, I didn't have room for Edgar Allan Poe, and you know things are pretty rough when you don't have room for Edgar Allan Poe. So we have Hölderlin. I always struggle with those, the O with the 2 dots on it, but, and I have his poetry elsewhere. His poetry is on my favorite shelf. Coleridge, Maturin Melmoth the Wanderer, Walter Scott, The Antiquary, Manzoni, The Italian, Betrothed. And then, yeah, I have George Eliot, Scenes of Clerical Life, which is one of her first books. And then Edgar Allan Poe. I have Dead Souls, 2 translations. I don't know, for some reason I've struggled with translations of Dead Souls. Now, I don't know Russian, so I can't, I'm not struggling because I'm comparing it, but they're too different, because I tried to read one. I think it was published by either Princeton or Yale, I can't remember, and it was good. That one stuck in my memory the most because I read it first. But then I wanted to try different ones because I heard different things about translations. Nabokov wrote about translations of Dead Souls. And then the Pavir and Volkonsky, I feel like they're okay if the style of a writer isn't super important. Like Dostoevsky, it's the ideas and the plot and the character is very important, but I've never heard him described as the most, intricate stylist, I guess I'd put it. Kind of like a Dickens character. Dickens blasted out his books, so he didn't have a lot of time to focus on the style. Just, he was good, so he didn't spend too much time on it. But I feel like Gogol, it's different. So anyway, let me know if you have a better recommendation for a translation. This is the NYRB, I think one of the more new ones, and then this is the Pavir Volkonsky, which I read Dostoevsky in their translation, but again, I don't think it's as vital. A bunch of Emerson, Library of America Emerson, his journals, and then his essays and lectures. Been reading more Emerson lately. Now I do I have an unforgivable shortage of Henry David Thoreau. At one point I had that NYRB selected journals, but I gave that away. I had a copy of Walden, but disappeared, and so I've been meaning to replace my Thoreau, but just haven't. This book here, The Quaker City by Lippard, Romance of Philadelphia. It's a novel from, I think, 1845 or something about Philadelphia in America, and haven't read that one yet, but it seemed interesting to be able to read about America in that time, Philadelphia too, rather than, a New York novel from that time, which is what you usually get. Jane Eyre, Kalevala, Elias Lönnrot, the collection of folk tales from Finland. And then more George Eliot, selected essays, poems, and other writings. And here we get to our Herman Melville. So I have probably Goethe and Melville are my two most comprehensive selections that I have, at least in this shelf here. When you get to the modernist era, all bets are off. But yeah, this is my favorite edition of Moby Dick, the paperback. There's also a hardcover that's usually pretty expensive, but it has really good illustrations. And then the Herschel Parker biography, volume 1 and 2. I did have other editions of it that weren't former library copies, but they got ruined in the fire I was in, and then my brother was nice enough to get me these, so they're pretty much pristine. Imagine that, library bought them and no one checked them out. They got rid of them. But then I have Herman Melville's correspondence. I also have his journals, but I need to clean those up a little bit. They still have some smoke on them that's kind of hard to get off, like the ash or whatever. But I kept that. And then Library of Americas. I have a bunch of Library of Americas for Melville. So Redburn, White Jacket, Moby Dick, and then his later works. I have the paperback of Pierre, Confidence Man, complete poems, which just came out recently. And then Hawthorne's complete novels. I've read The Scarlet Letter, but I really want to read The Marble Faun. Then we have the 1860 Leaves of Grass, which I think, all things considered, is his best. It's 5 years after the original printing, but then it doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff he added later in life on the deathbed edition. So it's a nice middle ground, published by University of Iowa. So if you want to try to find that copy, it's readily available. Also, it's a facsimile, so you can never go wrong with a facsimile. Goncharov, Turgenev, Chernyavsky, Lewis Carroll, Imre Madak. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but this is an interesting Hungarian work, The Tragedy of Man, published by the Corvina Press, which publishes a lot of Hungarian works. But as you can see here, if you want to read it, translated by George Sirtis. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right either, but most controversial work in the long history of Hungarian literature. Was first published in 1862. It was hailed as a great achievement, but at the same time it gave rise to a multitude of questions. So if you want to look at that, but as you see, names there: Milton, Goethe, Byron, and Ibsen. So he's an international figure, and he's hardly known in England. So if you haven't heard of that one, check it out. I was lucky enough to stumble across it at a bookstore. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have found out about it. And then Wagner's The Ring Cycle. Got the old chaps, Russian chaps, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Samuel Butler. Melville's Clara, which was 1876, on the centenary of the Declaration of Independence. And then George Meredith, Beauchamp's Career, which is a political novel, George Meredith's political novel. And it seems like his most interesting book. He's an interesting guy, George Meredith. He's not really read nearly as much anymore, but I've people who like Victorian stuff, if they even read George Meredith at all, they usually consider him one of the more difficult writers to read. So that's usually a good sign. I kind of connect Beauchamp's career with The Devils, or The Demons, by Dostoevsky. It's a political novel anyway. And we have Tennyson, gotta have some Tennyson. Nikolai Leskov, poems of Sidney Lanier, and then his novel, Tiger Lilies. So Sidney Lanier was from the South, from Georgia, and he fought in the American Civil War on the Confederate side. He wasn't really an ideologue. He lived there and he fought for it, to my understanding. And then while he was in there, he was writing Tiger Lilies, and he wrote poetry. Once he got out, once the war was over, he became basically a professor of English and wrote a history of English literature and studied it. Didn't live very long. I can't remember exactly how long he lived, but I think it was 50 years or something. And a lot of his stuff is getting reprinted. And then we have Mark Twain. Gotta have Mark Twain. Oddly enough, I haven't read either Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn in their entirety. When I was younger, I read, I think, the majority of Tom Sawyer, but I mean like younger. I mean, I was maybe, 11, 12 or something. I couldn't tell you the slightest thing of what happens in it. And then Huckleberry Finn, I've been meaning to read it for a while and just haven't yet. Got some more Tolstoy, Turgenev, George Meredith, The Egoist, which I think is his most well-known book, wrote in the 1880s. Then we have Edouard Dujardin, Will to the Woods No More, which after the fact has been called one of the earliest books that has a stream of consciousness style to it. Of course, that's completely overblown now, like everything stream of consciousness. If the character thinks in a novel, it's stream of consciousness, but this is actually in the tradition of, Joyce and Virginia Woolf and so on. Got the complete poetry of Robert Browning, Thomas Hardy, Leg Over Leg, the Egyptian writer. Got some dust on there. 4 volumes. It's bilingual. I just like wasting money, so I went ahead and got the bilingual edition, even though I'm highly unlikely I'll ever learn Arabic, but why not? It was available. Emily Dickinson, Longfellow. Longfellow was one of the first poets I really liked. Same thing with Edgar Allan Poe. Poems of Thomas Hardy, Jules Laforgue, who was very influential for T.S. Eliot and a lot of the early modernists. And then Tolstoy's Resurrection in 1899. And yeah, this shelf ends in 1899. My next shelf I'm going to make a video on begins in the year 1900. There are some books I didn't have room for. Martin Fierro, and then H. Rider Haggard, She, King Solomon's Mines, and Alan Quatermain. And then I have Mir Taki Mir, who wrote in Urdu, Selected Ghazals. This is the Murti Classical Library of India, same edition that I have Arjun and the Hunter in, and then I like this edition of Moby Dick. If I want to just carry it around, this is the one I carry. Nice cover and this nice floppy penguin. And then couldn't fit this either, James Fenimore Cooper, The Leatherstocking Saga. So nice edition of that. Well, anyway, hope you enjoyed this one. I will be making my next one of my modernist shelf. So do a little skim of that. As you can see, ends with Bottom's Dream. Death is a Gang Boss.